All right. Well, yeah, today I'm happy because, well, number one, it's been a busy week with the 8.2 launch and the webinar series, and today's the last day. But I'm also happy because we get to finally release and show something that we've been working hard on, and I'm pretty excited about it. So, as Jan mentioned, we have a new module. That's the third in our mini series of the 8.2 launch. We're launching this in parallel with 8.2, although it doesn't really have any specific dependency on 8.2, but it's nice to coordinate those together. And we're going to do some demos, but just a quick agenda. First, I think it's important to introduce what this module is and why we're doing this now. But then we'll jump right into a demo of an example solution of maybe how you would use it. We'll take an overview of what we saw, and then we'll do a second demo of something that is included in the module, which is a management console, and we'll do a brief overview of what's included in that. So I think the first question, we'll do like the W's, so the first one is, what is the Svy Security module? And I think it's important to first state, what problems it aims to solve, at least in this first version. And I think that it's important to reiterate what Jan said, that we're starting with a minimum, viable set of features. We know that a security framework or module could be very robust and have lots of features. And I think that in time, it certainly will. But what we want to do is we want to get something in the hands of our customers first, see what they like, see what they need, and then continue to iterate on that. We don't want to spend a year and build the wrong thing or do it the wrong way. So that's the approach here, and that's what we're going to keep doing. So in this first version, the primary problems or the goals that we try to achieve is to enable multi-user and multi-tenant applications. That should be the very first baseline goal of the security module. Next, to also provide a workflow for authentication, and that includes for users to authenticate with a password, to programmatically authenticate, and also to do token-based authentication, which we'll talk about. Also to facilitate permission control, so what a user can and can't do in an application, including what they can do in the user interface, what they can do with data, what they can do sort of in arbitrary runtime kinds of things. Something that's interesting that we've added to this is the ability to track user sessions and to do a bit of analytics there. So even if you do the look at the client stats table that ships with the app server of Servoy, if you enable that, that's sort of like real-time client stats, but this actually does historical session tracking, so you can really see who's done what. And finally, to provide a viable sort of foundation for any business application. The idea of this module is that pretty much if you build a business application, you have any security requirements, you can start with this and you can build on top of it. And maybe you need to add features or you need to extend it or you need to submit feature requests for it, but it should provide as a base for pretty much any customer of Servoy, and that's the goal. So why do we do this now? In the Servoy Customer Advisory Board, we work with a group of customers to advise us on where we can provide value. And one of the strongest feedbacks we got from them is that the extensions really provide value. They help with end user experience, and they help with developer productivity and overall developer happiness. So we've been making an effort on that for, I would say, the past year, all the web components and modules, et cetera, on GitHub. But we asked about this again at the Servoy World 2017 panel. And for those of you that were there, you might remember we did that at the very beginning because there was a big power outage and we couldn't do anything. So we did a verbal stand-up panel, which was kind of fun. And for me, I remember that there was a big consensus when the community there said that they want security and multi-tenancy, easy to use. And that really resonated, and we took that away and we went straight to work, and now we're ready. So we want to make this extension now because we have customers that need it, and we want them to start off with the right foundation. And it's when I see customers working on building a foundation themselves and putting lots of hours into it, I see that as a real problem, because it should be included in the platform and included in the extensions, and that's the primary value that Servoy provides. I also want to point out that this was a collaborative initiative. We baked a lot of the ideas in-house, but it was also built in collaboration with community members, and I'd like to give special thanks to some of our alpha adopters who have been using it even before now that we're releasing it, so they helped us to get it right, and it's brave of them to pin themselves to something which is still in progress. So I appreciate our alpha adopters, ISIL and ProSoft, which are North American customers who are already using this module. And I think that this approach, the fact that it was built and tested in collaboration with community members, really validates our mission, which is that Servoy is really a community of software developers, ISVs, and enterprise organizations building business applications, and they really share a lot of common goals and common frustrations and best practices, etc. And we can encapsulate these into extensions and deliver them, and then everybody does better. If everyone participates and Servoy is leading this, then I think it really validates why we're here and why Servoy can add value. So with that out of the way, we can jump right into the demo. The first demo is sort of an example of what features are available. So it's a demo solution, but I should say, let me jump right into it over here. I should say that this is not, the module itself is in no way a UI. It doesn't provide a UI. It doesn't provide an implementation specific way of doing things. But what we have here is an example of what can be done. So just keep that in mind. This isn't a user interface that we're shipping that looks like this. So the first thing that it provides is login. And so here we have a login screen which just shows that you're logging in a user of a specified tenant. You may require that the tenant is specified. You may have users that are unique in the whole system and you don't need a tenant. That choice is up to you. For here we just show a list of available tenants and a user and a password. Options to remember this as a cookie. So when we come back, we remember the username. Forgotten password workflow is also available. But this is just a form that was built to demonstrate the logging in. What I'm going to do is sign out again here and just sort of go into Servoy Developer. And I think the easiest way is to bring up the command console and just sort of show you what's happening under the hood. So the login form is calling the main scope, which is the Svy Security scope. Everything is done through API, and it's getting a user based on a username or a user and a tenant name. I'm going to just do this because I know it's unique in that tenant and store it to a variable. Yeah, I think I need to relaunch the client. Let me try that again. Okay. Well, this is what happens when I go off script. Null pointer exception. Maybe I do need to do the tenant. So then I have a user, and the user we can get their display name, right? You can see the display name of the user. And we could do something like log them in, or we could check their password. So we check the password that I typed was 123. You can see that it's true, and then so you get code complete on everything, and this is how the user was logged in. So let's go back to the demo solution here. I'm going to log in one more time. The first thing is just to note what the entities are of the security setup. So we have a tenant, and that's the primary partition of an application. And then within that tenant, we have users of that tenant and also the roles that users can belong to, which are also dictated by the tenant or inside the tenant. So if we expand this and we look at the user that's currently logged in, you see there's some general information, you know, the display name, the password, etc. The account status, we can lock an account. And then there's the member, the roles that the user is a member of. So you can see that they're a member of 2 roles. I can add them or remove them from one of these roles. And you can see over here on the right-hand side, it's just showing a bit of information about the current session. And you can see that the user's permissions change also here. Those are the permissions that are associated with the roles of the user. If I were to go to the roles here and expand this and look at, say, what can managers do, you can see also it shows the users that this is assigned to, and then it shows the permissions that are available. And permissions are exposed from the developer for the application. This is not something that a tenant would create. This is something that they would interact with. So you can see all the permissions that are available and the ones that are available for this role, and therefore when I was working with this tenant, because they belong to the role managers, they get manage categories and access financial data, I think it was, through that role. So that's sort of the setup of permissions. Now there are security checks available at runtime, sort of arbitrary security checks, and there's also the design time user interface and CRUD security checks. If we look at the runtime security checks, to do this, I'm gonna take a visitor. Well, we'll start with this user. Let's just say it's generating a report. You can see there's some sample report with some financial data. Because that user has the full permissions, you can see here to generate report and to access financial data. If I were to look at another user here, say Terry, and she or he only has the clerk's role, which we can see by the permissions, can generate the report but can't access the financial data. So if I sign in with Terry, you can see that the example report doesn't have the financial data. Moreover, if I were to sign in with the visitor, which didn't even have the permission to generate the report, I think it's visitor 1, then you could see that there's an error because they don't have the permission. This is as simple as calling user.hasPermission. So if we were to look at that form, which I think is something runtime security checks, and we look behind that form, we go through some methods here. This is what's generating the report, but first we ask the permission. This is not yet in the module, this is just in the example solution. But you can see down here, after we identify the user, we're just asking if the user has the permission. So that's all through the API. So the whole point of this, if it's lost in code, is that you can check if a user has a permission at any point at runtime. So let's move on to the design time parts. We're currently logged in still with visitor. If you look at that user's permissions, they only have restricted UI. They don't have the unrestricted UI or the partial UI, and I'll show what that means. So if we look at the design time UI, you can see that this field is disabled. These fields would be invisible. We're showing a little placeholder to show that the field was made invisible. The button's disabled, right? And that all comes from the design time privileges. Now, this goes back to if you're familiar with Servoy from the past, the sort of internal security engine and what's available at design time. So we have to switch over to developer to look at that. And I believe the form is sample UI form. I'll just close all these. And if we look at the security tab on the form, you can see that there are some internal, they're called groups in the design time. This is coming from the legacy security engine. But this is really what the permissions are. And these come from the developer at the design time. And what the permissions mean in terms of UI and data access come from design time. So it's not something that you have to programmatically build. It's also not something that your end users have to build. So we just reuse what's already in the engine to make it very easy for developers to generate design time permissions. So if we look at the restricted UI, you can see that various labels and fields, etc., are either disabled or invisible. Partial UI has a bit more going on, and then unrestricted UI has everything. So this is where this is coming from. You don't have to programmatically set it up. So if I were to log in with a user that has unrestricted UI, you can see that they would be able to see everything. The same is true for data as well. So if we look at, let's sign out and sign back in with Terry, who has sort of medium access. So first of all, you can see back at the design time that this user has a bit more access in terms of what's visible or accessible than the prior user. And that's all just done through design time and the association to those permissions. At the data level, we can come in here and this is important because if you had misconfigured something, so the user's not supposed to be able to, I think, insert or update in this case, or sorry, insert or delete, just read and update. So if for some reason you didn't also block the UI portion, the areas where they could maybe click a delete button, you still have the safety net of the CRUD permissions or the data permissions. So in this case, the user can read in a record, load a record, and maybe edit it and save it. But if they wanted to create a new record, you can see that the following permission isn't assigned. You don't have access. And that's coming right out of the internal security engine. I don't have to check for that. It just happens. I mean, it's nice if you check for it, because then maybe you give your user a nice error, but you don't have to. By applying that permission, it's enforced for you automatically. There's no checking. The only one we checked here was the runtime security check. Design time, we're not fiddling with the form and checking the user and disabling things. That all happens automatically. Same with the data permissions. So I can't delete the record or save it, or sorry, create it. So that's sort of the overview of how the permissions work and how users work and log in. Again, this is just sort of an example solution that shows how it works. This ships with the security module, so you can kind of open this up and read the descriptions and go to the places in code and see how the API is used, because everything is API first. Okay, so that concludes that demo. Just a quick overview of what we saw. Here are the entities in the security model, and this is how it's kind of set up. You have an application. The application exposes permissions that are inherent to the application, both arbitrary permissions that you might check at runtime, design time UI permissions, and design time data permissions. Now, upon those permissions, you can build roles. You have a tenant, and a tenant is the primary partition, and then you have roles that you can associate with the tenant. You can create users, add them to roles, etc. Users have sessions, and we track those. So tenants are really where the application is separated. It could be individual customers, it could be an organization or department. However, you would have a strict separation of users and roles. Users themselves who are authenticated to the application. They belong to a single tenant, and they get assigned to those tenants' roles. And we also track their sessions when they log in and log out. The roles themselves belong in a single tenant, so you're not sharing roles across tenants. This is something that your end users would do. It can contain many users, and the roles are what you grant those inherent application permissions to, and then the users get them. Those permissions are managed and exposed by developers. So that's where you saw me in the IDE going to the security tab on the table and on the form. And so that's what we would, if you're familiar with legacy or the internal, I don't want to say legacy, but the internal security engine, they're called groups. And I think this is the most confusing part about this setup, but it's also what allows us to reuse the existing design time security and the runtime engine, is just to take those groups and expose those as permissions and be able to associate those to roles and users. So that's how it works. And remember that when those permissions were applied, so when those fields were disabled or those CRUD actions were denied, there was no requirement by the developer to check them. They happen automatically. It's automatically enforced by the existing Servoy Security engine. So the permissions are applicable across all tenants, and they're granted to users via their roles. So the developer exposes them, and then maybe the tenant at the end users, admin user or someone can create a user, can create roles, can decide which permissions go in the roles and which users get those roles. We didn't really see much in this example, but we'll see more in the next example about sessions. So we track and archive authenticated sessions. So we get a historical record of who's accessed the application, for how long, some extra data that we can associate with that. It's available for mining and for some analytics. You could combine it with audit logs for powerful traceability to know exactly when a user did something, in what session, what else they did, etc. Finally, I just want to reiterate that the demo we just saw was a UI that's built on top of the module, but the module itself is a completely API-first approach. So that includes object-oriented usage. It's self-documenting, so any of those methods, as you start, you get code complete, you get documentation right there in the tooltips as you're getting code complete. It's strongly typed as well, so if you misuse it, you get build markers, you get runtime exceptions. Also, it's completely documented in the wiki, both with a bit of example and also API documentation. The coding is fairly intuitive, object-oriented. Here's an example. I typed a bit out in the command console to show you, but you know, you could just get a role by name, you can add a permission by name, you can get a user, you can add the user to the role, you can check if that user has permission, etc. It's quite straightforward. Demo number 2. So in addition to the module, which is the API, we also ship a management console for developers or system admins. So let's jump over to, and this one I run from a cloud server. I should log out and log in, so it is password protected. So this itself is a UI that we build and ship. So this is not some reference implementation or some example. This is actually a management console that you can get with a security module, and you can use it to administer your application. It does require a user login. However, this is the internal Servoy users. So if you just go to your admin page and you look at users, you can see that this is where that user is coming from. So it's unrelated to the security of actual applications. And I think that's intuitive and makes sense. So we're going to sign in, and you can see that we arrive at the management console, and we get a bit of metrics here. We get some information about tenants and users. The first thing you could do is provision a new tenant and get them started, so that if you want to onboard someone on a new SaaS offering, all you have to do is come in here, make a new tenant, make a new user, and set them up. So we could drill down to the tenants. Oh my gosh, this happened. Let me log out and log in. I don't know why this was happening just before the demo. Try this again. There we go. I'm not sure what happened. I just started testing this with 8.2 this week, so we have some things to check. Anyway, the tenant list here, we drill down from the main dashboard. We could search this, so we can arrive at one tenant. We can drill further into the tenant, and we see a bit of the tenant detail, including how many users they have, if they have any currently active sessions, how many total sessions they've run historically. We see some metrics about their usage for the last 6 months. This is actually, session hours over time. So you could see if they're increasing their usage or decreasing. Just some ideas about analytics. This could always be expanded. You can do some things at the tenant level here, like you could add a new user, okay, provision someone new to the system. You can take a look at what roles are available. You could make a new role. Typically, this would be done by end users. So remember, who is using this application is a developer or a system administrator for a software offering, not the actual end users. So typically, end users are, maybe an administrative user is going to be responsible for, and you guys are going to build your own custom UIs to enable end users to add users and create roles and associate permissions to roles. But if for some reason you want to do that for them, or you want to see what they've done, you can do it right here. So you can add users to roles, remove users from roles, grant permissions to roles, etc. If we go back to the tenant detail, you can see that you could actually lock an entire tenant, so that prevents anyone from accessing the system. So if you had some security concern, you could do that. Of course, you could delete a tenant in the rare event that you might want to do that. If I go back out to the home screen, you'll notice that I have also some metrics on, like, the top 6 tenants with the most users, total usage for the entire application over the last 6 months. And you could drill in on this chart here. So if I wanted to see the same tenant and look at their users this way, I could. So again, you get some metrics here on the tenant. You could drill into the users. I could do a bit more search here too. So we could drill into this guy and see the detail. Some things that you could do at the tenant or at the user detail. You can see how many, again, how many historical sessions that user has, total usage they've had, if they have any active sessions. There's a metric of usage over time. You can see what roles they're provisioned to. This user doesn't have any. You could add them to a role if you wanted to. So this tenant doesn't even have any roles. This is just some dummy data that was inserted. You could lock the user, and of course you could delete the user if you really wanted to. What I'd like to show you is I'll go back to the dashboard here, and I'll just reload this page here and show you. Now I'm on actually like an Amazon EC2 instance, and so I'm gonna log into that example solution on that server, and then you can see what the management console does with an active session. So I'll come in here and use my buddy Pat again. And if I come back here to, I could click the refresh, we're not broadcasting that particular change. You can see that the active session goes to 1. And so if I log in here someday and I see, oh, I got 20 active sessions, and I click on the active sessions metric, then it takes me right to a list. I could search if I had a bunch of sessions concurrently. So, you get a call from someone, you want to look at the active sessions, see what they're doing, I don't know. You can come in here and find it. Now, when you get into the session detail, you get some information about that individual session. Now, this is a real-time session that's active, but you get the same information about any historical session in the past. So you can see who the user was, who the tenant was, which IP address they came from, some user agent string from the browser, information about start and end and last activity, how long the session lasted. So you can see that this session hasn't ended because it's active. If I were to go back to, I don't know, let's just go back into this particular tenant who has that active session, I could look at the historical sessions and get the same information. So this is a historical session. It lasted 1 hour and 51 minutes on August 9th. from somewhere in Japan, it looks like. So the session data is not just real time, it's also historical. Finally, I'd like to show you what happens if we lock a user, just to show you some example of what an administrator could do. So if I came in here to this tenant, looked at their users, and said we want to lock this user out, they were suspended, I don't know. Then we lock the user, we can give a reason. Yeah, this is something you just get kind of internally. You have the option to set the duration of a lock. So again, this is everything here is programmatic. You could do through the API. So you could also use this for locking if after 3 failed login attempts, you could lock the account for 30 minutes. In this case, I'll leave it blank, and that means the lock is there indefinitely until I unlock it. So now you can see that the status is locked. Here's the reason why it was locked. And then I can unlock the user here. But if I come in here and I'll just copy this and start another session and try to log in with that user, you can see that I'm blocked from logging in. We don't really give, in this example, we don't really give any information to the user about why they're locked or anything, but you could, or you could even just not tell them that they're locked and just say, you know, password failed or something. It's up to you. So that's how we can, from outside the application, lock the user. We can now unlock Terry, and hopefully Terry can now log in. There we go. So, and then back here we should see at the tenant, oops, at the tenant level and at the system level, we now have 2 active sessions, Pat and Terry. So, so hopefully that gives you an idea about the security console, the management console, and some of the features that are there. I'll give you a quick overview. So this is, again, I want to reiterate, is for use by application administrators, not end users, for tasks like manually provisioning tenants, administering users' permissions and roles, although typically this is done by the end users themselves. You could do it for them. Maybe you get a support call. You know, they can't run a report or something. You log in, you see that, oh, well, you don't have the permission to run the report, and you enable it, and then, you know, then they say, oh, it works right away. Great. I think importantly, you can analyze usage, and that's an area I think that we can grow. So if we talk about what's next, I think one of the very next things we're going to have to do is to do some partition at the application level, and we knew that going into this, but we wanted to get something out and in production as soon as possible. So now you can imagine that you want to keep the same security setup, but you have 2 different applications with different different roles and different permissions, but you still have the same users and the same tenants, for example. So that's one area that we're looking into do next. Of course, I think we can expand the analytics. We don't really know what analytics are important, so we put some on there that I think are interesting. I think the usage is an interesting metric, but we really have that session data now in the detail form. So what kind of aggregates we want to draw from it, you know, just remains to be seen. One thing I didn't show here is that there's also token-based authentication. I didn't show the forgotten password workflow, but we do support that. So remember that you can just programmatically log in a user. We support you know, password-based authentication, but you can also generate a token for a user that expires in a given time frame that you specify. So for things like sending a deep link, where they can then become with a token which expires, they can authenticate in and reset their password. And that's available right now, and it's in use by the folks that are already, I think one of the folks that are already using this module. So that's a nice feature that I didn't show, but we may look to expand that and even provide a bit of email integration. If we actually capture email addresses for users, then we might piggyback some of those features on email, like sending the deep link for you, and then you just provide a mail template or something like that. So again, anything that's a really common workflow, we want to try to alleviate the need for developers to build that themselves. Another cool thing we could do is we could link the session to the audit log. So you may know that Servoy provides audit logging that you can do on a table by table basis. It's actually also part of security as well, because you can decide who gets audited and on which tables, and that comes from the design time settings. We didn't show an example of that, but it is available. So then you could take that a step further, and you could link the session record to, or link the audit records to a session and say, okay, well, you know, what did a user do historically? I want to go back in time and say, okay, well, last year at this time, here's where the user was logged in for an hour, and here's everything they did in that session. So that's good for, I think, you know, compliancy and data security. Another thing that we could look forward to in the future is maybe enhancing the design time portion. So this is, the design time permissions come from sort of the classic Servoy security engine. Again, that allows us to make a portion of this design time so developers don't have to do some weird configuration task to expose permissions. They can just do it right from the IDE, and I think that's great, although that part of Servoy really hasn't changed in many, many years, and I think that we could probably enhance that a bit and make it more friendly to this type of application. But ultimately, what we do next, we want to hear from you guys. We already have this, as I said, in use by a few customers. I hope that people pick this up and run with it and give us lots of feedback. Just about how to get started and, you know, how to participate. The project home is on the Svy Security project homepage, and there you'll find complete wiki documentation. It's where you could file issues and feature requests. There's also binary releases there that you can download. And because Servoy 8.2, if you missed Wednesday's webinar, Servoy 8.2 allows you to import modules from the web package manager. So in fact, if you were in the IDE and you went to your web package manager here, loading, it takes a while to query GitHub, I think, and you look at Servoy Solutions, you'll now see the security module here, the administrative console, which contains the module, and the example solution, which also contains the module. So those two applications that I just showed you, plus the module itself, are all available through the web package manager. So if you're running 8.2, you can just go in here and click and add the module to your application and get started today. I'll leave the useful links up, and I'll ask the moderators. Jan, do we have any questions?
Yeah, there's a bunch of questions coming in.
Okay.
A question from Richard: which earlier versions of Servoy can this module run with?
Okay, yeah, I forgot to mention that. So right now we're building it and testing it from 8.1 on. So it's compatible with 8.1, although we made a separate build for 8.2 because the binaries can, for the example solution in the console, can include web components. So in 8.2 we made a special export so that when you import that, it also imports the web components. But it's compatible from 8.1 on. You just have to add those separately.
Okay, thanks. So question from Bob: is it multi-tenants, for example, master, then site, then department, then user? Right.
So we thought about that, and what we ultimately decided is that we're not going to invent ways that you might, because if you've seen a lot of applications like we have, you can see that people do this part many different ways. Like some companies have departments and it's hierarchical, and if you belong to if you belong to a couple departments, then you can see certain records in those departments, etc. Whereas others, you may even have users that are like third-party contractors that can see across multiple companies, right? So what we ultimately decided is that we don't want to guess the different ways that this is done, and in fact, data filtering itself is not really part of the equation here, although we do filter the security data itself. So once you're authenticated, then if you ask for users, you get the users of the current tenant. You don't get to see through the API even other data. But it's just that this is the primary partition is at the tenant, and so if you choose to do data filters within that, you still do that yourself. We may add that in the future, maybe some ways to facilitate that, but we're not going to impose any structures here because I think it complicates things and there's a chance that we wouldn't even get it right.
I think Ruben has a follow-up question on that. Can you briefly show how tenant data separation is done?
How tenant data, I can talk about it. So that's done in the security database that this ships with, although you're not really meant to interact with it directly. You're meant to go through the API to sort of insulate you from doing the database stuff. The database itself does get filtered. There's a tenant ID in every table, except for permissions, which is cross tenant. So the data itself does get filtered immediately upon the session initialization. So if you're authenticated, a user always belongs to a tenant, and as soon as that user is authenticated through the API, you don't have to do anything. The security is automatically filtered on that tenant.
Okay. And there's a question from Quail. Is there an option for pass-through authentication?
Pass-through authentication. Yeah, so you could do that with a token that doesn't expire. So for organizations that want to be able to auto log in a user, if that user has a token and the token doesn't expire, then the token-based authentication will work.
And a question from Birgit. Can a user be assigned to more than one tenant?
No. So a tenant is the primary partition, and that's goes back to the other question. So we're not allowing. Now you may have your own tables that have organizations within within a tenant, and then they could be assigned to different organizations, and you filter that data differently. But for right now, we're saying there's a strict partition. A tenant is really, this is really for a multi-tenant application, and that's where the primary partition happens on the security level.
All right, it looks like those are all the questions. Of course, we recommend everybody to go and try it out. It's just one click now from the IDE to start using it. Post your feedback in the forum on what you're experiencing. There is documentation on that project homepage link that was up. When is the next session, Sean?
Oh yeah, I'll bring that slide up here. The next session is September 15th, and it's to be announced. I think we're going to do something related to NG client components and services, but we haven't finalized that. So we'll announce that through the regular email update. I also just did want to say that there is complete API documentation. So if you go to the security project home, there's really complete API documentation. It shows all the classes, it shows all the top level functions and all the classes, and it's hyperlinked within itself. So if you want to see what does consume access token do? Oh, it returns a user. Then what can a user do? Well, a user you can get the tenant of a user, etc. So even before you download, you can go there and check it out and see if what it might do for you.
Cool, looks good. All right, well, thanks everybody for attending. Thanks for the great questions and feedback that you've been giving us, and we hope to see you all in 2 weeks. Have a great weekend, and Sean, thanks for presenting.
My pleasure.
The recordings will be up somewhere later today. Thanks everybody. Bye bye.